Well, good afternoon. It's my pleasure to welcome Milo Mumgaard to the presentation series. I've known Milo for at least 6 years, and we've done 10 projects. I'm Dave Goffin, by the way. I'm the Director of Environmental Studies here at UNL, and one of the things that we've become involved in is engaging our students in the community. And Milo has been a great supporter of ours. Like I said, 5 or 6 years we've been doing projects, and 10 years, or at least 10 projects that we've done. And so we've had a lot of opportunity to interact. He was the founder of the Appleseed Foundation. He served as where we came in contact was he was the mayor's general counsel here in Lincoln, and also served as sustainability coordinator. He got many positive things going with regards to sustainability here in Lincoln. He's currently the executive director of Legal Aid of Nebraska. And with that, Milo, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Dave. The projects that we have done together range from the figuring out how much solar power we can generate on the roofs of the municipal buildings in Lincoln, Nebraska, which is a launch, by the way. Students did that. We did if you go to the Pinnacle Bank Arena right now and wander around, and all the information that's posted about recycling and landfills and all of that, and energy use, but mostly about recycling and landfill use, even the actual receptacles are special designed for the arena. That was a project that came out of a UNL student project. So, among others, there's a whole bunch of others. So, the reality is that it's been, I've had a very profitable, for my purposes, relationship with Dave and the Environmental Studies program, to say the least. Well, I'm very pleased to be here today to talk about the disproportionate impact of climate change on low-income Nebraskans, and thinking about it from the legal implication side of things. What are some of the broad picture that we can take of this of the impacts, and how can we draw some sort of reasons for action from here? So what I'm going to do, I'm going to give you I'll paint a quick picture of what I'm going to be doing for the next half hour or so. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to walk through, because a lot of people really don't even know what legal aid is. So I'm going to make sure you all are aware of that and have a real good grasp of why implications of climate change are relevant to what a program that I run around the state, but why it's relevant. And we're going to look at poverty a little bit as well. Who's in poverty in Nebraska? Who are the low-income, poor Nebraskans that we have in mind here when we're talking about when we're talking about implications of climate change on their lives? And then we're going to get into a little bit about what disproportionate impact is, what the history of environmental justice and things of that nature are, and how lawyers and the law have been involved in environmental work from the perspective of its impacts on low-income people for a long time. So this is not a novel area, but nevertheless it's a kind of a new area to think about it in the context of climate change. Then we're going to talk about some of the things. When I was at the city, as Dave mentioned, I worked with the mayor, and we did a lot of things to try to think about these disproportionate impacts and how we were implementing strategies to try to lower those impacts, as an example. And then we're going to turn to the whole issue of, okay, what about the legal implications of what I just described? What kinds of things are folks like us at Legal Aid thinking about, but also more generally, what can you think about when you're thinking about what are some of the rights and the responsibilities and so on that society has vis-a-vis low-income populations and the impacts of climate change. And then we'll wrap up with a little bit of discussion about what's ahead of us and what's going forward, because we all know that times they are changing, to say the least. So you can all mark your calendar, November 9th on. We'll see what life is like. So with that, I think I'll run now through what is Legal Aid real quick. Very basically, we are Nebraska's largest nonprofit law firm, and we provide free civil legal services to low-income people who are eligible for our services. They have to be below 125% of the poverty level, which we'll get to here in a second. But we're spread around the state. Obviously, most of our work and attorneys are in Omaha, Lincoln, and the large urban areas, but we're definitely an urban-rural practice. We hit across the board. We have attorneys able to represent people across the entire state, and whether they're our staff attorneys or whether they are folks that we actually hire in various places around the state to do some work. Now, what is legal aid? Underlying it all, it's effectively an anti-poverty organization. It's not just a law firm where we do good legal work on behalf of people who need legal services. And again, we're talking about the civil side, by the way. I often forget to remind people that we're not criminal defense, we're not public defenders. We are the folks who do the civil side of stuff. And when we think about the civil side of stuff, that's the relationships that people have, that's their lives, that's they're making a living, that's all of their children, their families, all those sorts of things that wind up in the judicial system. And inevitably, there's an aspect of it that says, what's going on here that's helping them to address the causes and effects of poverty. What's the actual sort of dividend of our work that addresses their plight, being low income and in poverty. And this gives you a real quick snapshot, at least for 2015, and by the end of 2016, we'll update this, but which we are almost at the end of 2016. But it basically gives you a picture of who is represented by legal aid. As you can tell, it's mostly women that actually are our direct clients. There's a number of explanations for that. And of course, there's a smattering of disabled, smattering of immigrants, smattering of veterans, all these kinds of sort of constituencies that we certainly represent over the course of the year with the cases that we do. But one thing that is always the case, except with some very small exceptions, we do have some exceptions, and sort of, I can certainly tell you what those are, but almost always our clients are very poor, 100% of poverty and below. So therefore, who does legal aid represent? We represent the folks in Nebraska who are the people with the least amount of means, with the least ability to meet their daily and weekly needs and things of that nature. So what do we do? What's kind of the broad brush stuff that we do? We have priorities. We obviously don't do everything. That would be a little bit impossible. But what we do is we focus on family and consumer and housing and public benefits and income and educational issues sometimes come into play, and certain employment issues come into play. Entrepreneurial kinds of stuff for low people, we certainly want to work with that in both an urban and a rural way. This is something that is very important to know. What is it that legal aid does? I spend a lot of time talking to folks about who legal aid is, what we do, and why we do it. And this is the context in which we work. We work, when I say family law, that's everything from folks who are victims of domestic violence who need representation to get away from an abuser, perhaps to get the custody of their child solidified, and then in turn to ensure that they have the opportunity to have a life, free and independent of the abuser. So there's a lot of legal work that's necessary for that. To just your basic solutions where you have, families that fall apart. And how do we help low-income people do this in the best possible way so that they access income, all those sorts of things. Housing, landlord-tenant, ownership, consumer would be lots of debt, lots of bankruptcy, lots of ability to help people think about how we can represent them. There's a lot of injustice out there in the weeds of Nebraska, and that's where legal aid works and lives. And the more we can do about injustice and these kinds of issues that people come across, that's what we want to do. So, as you can tell from this slide, throughout, our objective always is to achieve some measurable and positive outcomes that is related to helping folks get up and out of poverty and to help their families be more stable and secure. So, that's a real quick snapshot of what legal aid is and why it's relevant to this topic today. As you can tell, we intersect with and relate to over 20,000 people a year. So there's a lot of interaction that's a lot of clients out there who get our legal services where we go to court, where we go to administrative activity, we help people represent themselves, we even go to the legislature at times, which is a legitimate thing that we can do. And we certainly at all times are helping people understand what their rights are and what they can do to stand up for themselves. And that's a big deal that I'm giving to you today. And I'm made available here in this suite here, this 209 here. We've got a couple of annual reports. You can go online and certainly see our annual report in more detail about it. And we also have a brand new video that I'm out here promoting to make sure you go online. Just posted within the last few days. It really is an evocative snapshot of who legal aid is, what we do, our clients, our staff, the sort of empowering and exciting things that are going on with legal aid for us. So I encourage you to do that. Okay, let's turn to the topic at hand, which is poverty. As you can tell, this is an area that legal aid knows a heck of a lot about, because this is the world in which we exist in terms of our legal work and the kinds of stuff that we do to ensure that people have their rights protected and laws enforced that go to their interests and so on. But what we're dealing here when we're talking about poverty is really a combination of income. Certainly that's a definer of low-income people in poverty. It's how much your income is relative to the size of your family and so on. It ain't much. Let me remind you of that. It's very, very little. The amount of income that puts you under poverty, if you're, say, a family of 3 or 4, mom with 2 kids, so on, you really can't have much income at all. I mean, barely. I mean, you're below minimum wage, making less than minimum wage, supporting your family. You're in poverty. So when we talk about, the upwards of 125% of poverty, which is what legal age represents, that's about 350,000 people across Nebraska. That's a ton of people that are directly eligible for our services. But that means that they're so poor, they really don't have the ability to meet the needs of their day-to-day lives, except for sort of wheeling and dealing and going forward every day. Is a not everyday crisis, but it almost darn near is, in terms of meeting the needs of your family and how you ensure that you're going to get to the next day, keep a roof over your head, keep your meals on the table, keeping safe, all of these kinds of things. That takes all of your resources, all of them. And this quote here I think is quite good. It's from a book that I recommend you take a gander at, called Evicted, which really breaks down the lives of people in poverty from the perspective of the housing, from the perspective of the housing crisis, from the perspective of how difficult it is for low-income people to get stable and secure housing. And in Nebraska, that's certainly the case. But again, it's lives that are topsy-turvy at best, and moments of calm, but lots of crisis. Now, we've been involved also in an effort at the legislature called the Intergenerational Poverty Task Force, which has tried to figure out whether there are issues specific to intergenerational poverty, families that go one generation to the next and nobody seems to get up and out of poverty, or they're getting out of poverty for a short period of time and they fall back into poverty and so on and so forth, and that their social mobility and their income mobility and economic mobility is so limited. In the context of that, we work with UNO, Center for Public Research, and work with legislators certainly, and they've produced, the UNO folks have produced a lot of great relatively up-to-date poverty data. I want to show you this slide because it gives you a taste for across the state where poverty is deepest. And the red on this map is where poverty is, I believe it's above 14%. Is that right? Yeah. So above 14% of the population is in that deep poverty that I was just talking to you about, a deep state of inability to really make ends meet at any given point in time. That's a heck of a lot of people when you think about 14-50% of the population in a given county. And we're talking Lancaster, Douglas, we're talking, significant population centers for the state of Nebraska. Not just, rural counties that have a grand total of 300 people. So the point here is that there is a lot of deep poverty around the state, that much of which gets somewhat overlooked or not even understood. In Lancaster County, for example, where we're at right now, we're actually on the very edge as we stand here in Hardin Hall. We're sort of on the edge of some of the more deep red census tracts. Taking the previous map, that was the whole state, the county, bringing it down to Lancaster County and dropping it down into census tracts. And you see the red here indicates extremely deep poverty, over 29%. And this tells you census tracts that have poverty rates of 38% all the way to 98% for the people that live in that census tract. So right around here, around East Campus, right around this area, is some of the deepest poverty areas you're going to find. Some of that's explained to some degree in Lincoln because of the student population and so on, but that's not ultimately the explanation. There's a lot of people in poverty. There's a lot of things going on around the state, by the way, both in Lancaster County and Omaha, Grand Island, and so on, to look at this issue of who's in poverty, where they live, what their conditions are. There's a lot of work going on around the state. So there's no shortage of understanding the context in which people are living and going through their lives in. The question is, what do you do about it, ultimately? So at Legal Aid, we are seeking to take our own look at poverty and figure out what to do about it from our own sort of renewed or reinvigorated approach to what we're doing at Legal Aid. And so we've done a project called the Fresh Look Project over the last 6 months to a year, in which we've asked hundreds of organizations, and we've asked thousands of clients, and we've asked many, many, many leaders and political this and business that, What do you think are the main issues and challenges that these people in poverty, these people very low income, are facing on a day-to-day basis? And it was a wonderful experience because we were able to remind people that legal aid is all about what I've just described here, helping people get up and out of poverty through the power of the law. So we need to think about how we can deliver that particular kind of service most effectively. The Fresh Look Project has been all about that. And it's leading us to think about, well, okay, what are these causes of poverty that we're looking at? And this is a chart that shows some of the feedback we've received, and we tabulated it and pulled it together. And I won't spend much time here or force you to look at all these nice colored blocks and figure out what they say. It basically boils down to, it's housing, affordable housing, it's healthcare, lack of income, which is like, oh, really? Low income, lack of income, makes sense. Which means good employment, which means the ability to have money that they can get and keep. So therefore, people complain about it and have problems with debt, things of that nature. And of course, family functionality and things of that nature as well. So in other words, this is not rocket science, but it's a means of confirming that we need to be thinking about these very issues, including, for example, we heard a lot about utilities. We heard a lot about the fact that people are spending a ton of money every month on their electric bill and their gas bill and their water bill, and they don't have the money to spend on that. That's kind of the bottom line, but yet they have to spend it in order to have a habitable place to be. $300, $400, $600 kind of gas bills are not unheard of in this neighborhood that we're sitting in right now. And the perceived key needs that people have, well, what do we do about it kind of thing? Well, we help people to get access to health care, help them to get more income in a certain way, help them deal with their transportation issues, which is another very interesting finding in all this work, that people really struggle with getting from home to work, from work to school, to get their kids to school, to get here and there. And it's not just it's an urban and a rural phenomenon. It's not an isolated, folks that live in this place have transportation problems, can't get a car, whatever it might be. It's actually across the board. Everywhere we go in the state, we hear about transportation as a major problem that low-income people have. Okay, so the topic of today is the implications of climate change in the lives of these very people that I just described. And then there in turn, the impacts in their lives, and then in turn what's the legal implications. I'm assuming, I spent 6 years working with Dave and working with the mayor, working creating various activities that all was about, we believe that climate change is real and the scientists got it right. In fact, in the publication that the Department of Natural Resources, or School of Natural Resources did, led by Don Wilhite and others, and Climate Center and so on and so forth out of UNL here, on climate change and its impacts on the state of Nebraska more generally, which I believe was the fall of 2013. Does that seem right? Did that came out somewhere there? Yeah, which is basically the Bible on this for Nebraska. If you haven't seen it, haven't read it, you should go look at it. And in there is one of the attachments, one of the appendices, is a piece we put together on the implications for urban cities in Nebraska and what's going on with climate change as it relates to cities and what are the responsibilities of cities. Nevertheless, climate change, I would say, is abundantly understood in this crowd as, I wouldn't be doing a sustainability presentation, I don't think, to a crowd that doesn't believe in climate change. So, ergo, what happens with climate change? Well, in a time of climate chaos and dwindling resources, our society will have to face many more moments of danger, superstorms, intensifying wildfires, droughts, shortages of food and water, rising sea levels, new pathways to the spread of disease. And in a post-Katrina world, and this book is by Van Jones, The Green Collar Economy, which is another good Bible for you folks that want to work on low-income issues associated with climate change and the future of the green economy. It's written in 2008. Katrina was most definitely on people's minds, even at that point in time. And we must remember those left behind in the Gulf Coast disaster and say, never again. And that's essentially what I'm saying today. Climate change and its impacts impact people in different ways, there's different vulnerabilities, there's different lives that are being affected and so on and so forth. But the bottom line is that we cannot go forward with climate change and the impacts of climate change and never recognize that we're not going to leave folks behind. That's basically the point here. Because communities in poverty One way to look at it is they're on the front line of climate disaster. They, as we'll talk about here in a few minutes, the reality of the lives these people have been explaining here today, or talking to them today, is such that having any sort of impact of the sort that a superstorm will create, or a flood will create, or a massive problem with the energy or water grid, whatever it might be, the reality is that the people we're talking about really cannot absorb the impacts in any way, shape, or form. So we have the ethical, moral, economic, political, and legal obligation, really, to work on that and think about those issues, and think about them now, and think about how we can do more with that. Because again, these folks are on the front line. My nice middle-class professional life ain't going to be that effective for a long time. My Astro, by the way, is going to be dying right now. I don't know if that's time to change. That's my big issue in my life, is I'm going to lose my Astro. But anyway, the point is, these are the communities we're talking about, and these are the communities that Legal Aid works with every day. And how we hear from them, by the way, we hear from people on the phone, online, out in the community. Boy, that's how we see them. That's how we get with them, and so on. Okay, so what's the disproportionate impact aspect? Many of you may have honed in on this issue. This is kind of a nice, I wouldn't say sexy issue in the world of climate change research and things of that nature, but it is obviously a very stout area of activity of thinking about impact, disproportionate impact on climate change activity. But I would say this, it hasn't been a particularly stout research topic in the United States. It's generally speaking, it's going to be like, what's going to happen with the Bangladeshi lowlands? What's going to happen with the drought that's affecting X part of Africa? Things of these nature, which of course are very sympathetic and very appropriate to think about. But you don't tend to see a lot of thinking and a lot of intellectual activity, as well as a lot of activism around the issues related to poor people, low-income people in Nebraska and the United States, and how it's affected. But the reality is the disproportionate impact that we're talking about here is indeed a very similar, or very same kind of impact that you will know about and think about with respect to those communities. Because what we have in the United States is we have both on an urban and rural context, we have people who lack the resources to respond to adapt. Well, that's pretty obviously true here in the United States. We have folks who spend much higher percentage of their money on basic needs that are affected by climate change, such as food, such as energy, such as transportation. And the people that are most affected by climate change, whether they're in Bangladesh or they're here in Northeast Lincoln in Nebraska, are the very young, the very old, the sick, the disabled, and of course the poor, who do not have these resources and are a very vulnerable population. So while the imagery may be different, the impacts are the same. And that's something to keep in mind. In fact, a very interesting statistic that I've come across is in thinking in terms of impact, it's not just impacts from the nature of climate change, but it's also impacts from efforts to try to mitigate and adapt to climate change. Spend a lot of time at the city thinking about mitigation and adaptation and resilience and those kinds of concepts, and how to build that into policy. But one has to remember this, one particular cap and trade program effect to lower carbon dioxide emissions by 15%, which is considerable to say the least, would have cost 3.3% of the average income of households in the lowest income bracket. It would have increased their cost 3.3%. That's a pretty precise statistic, but just take it for what it's worth, 3.3%. Whereas in the top income bracket, it would have increased the costs or the percentages for them only by 1.7%. So in other words, folks are actually able to quantify this kind of thing. That as we think about cap and trade, as we think about policies, we think about ways in which we can try to mitigate, adapt, be more resilient, and so on. Lo and behold, many of those things actually do promote and facilitate a disproportionate impact. Well, there's really no surprise about this, of course. And we're standing here at a school that has resources with an environmental studies program. I'm sure all of you have been briefed many times over that low-income communities have been, and communities of color, and things of that kind of constituency, are, as a matter of fact, historically been has felt the brunt of environmental actions and decisions in the United States. Where do you put a dam? Where do you put a pipeline? Where do you go mine for this? Where do you go dig up and put in a landfill? Where do you put it in a chemical factory and have toxic pollution, et cetera, et cetera? Well, you're not exactly putting them in your wealthy neighborhoods. You're not exactly putting those in places where people have some political and economic power. What you're doing is you're actually putting it in exactly where these things are happening and have been for generations, exactly where the most vulnerable people are going to be affected. So, indeed, from an environmental justice context, this has been a salient issue for a long time. And that, wait a minute, how is it right that the people that bear the brunt of decisions that have an environmental impact are those with the least economic power? Why is it done over and over and over again? Good question, and it also, I think, implicates a lot of things for us to think about. But it's no surprise when we're talking about disproportionate impact of climate change on low-income people, those kinds of things, those impacts have been felt for a good long time, no doubt about it. Now, this audience here doesn't have any problem understanding what these impacts from climate change are going to be, of course. And they are, generally speaking, the kinds of health consequences, the kinds of consequences related to the ability to realize and meet basic needs and so on. So, for example, this is a nice article. I've been reading a lot about climate change and civil rights issue, which would be a kind of another issue for another day. But the bottom line from the 2014 National Climate Assessment Report, which is the big, speaking of, that must have been 2014 when we came out with the state report, by the way, because it was a companion effect to this. Really did articulate very well the kinds of consequences and impacts that climate change wrought upon low-income communities in particular. And you're going to have, heat waves causing strokes. You're going to have dramatic increase in deaths, cardiovascular, respiratory, kidney diseases, a function of air pollution and other kinds of things that are a function of heat waves and are a function of things that are occurring, et cetera, et cetera. What you're going to have is poor people winding up being exposed to contaminated water from floods and disease-carrying insects and losing property and so on and so forth. And you're going to have energy, less reliant energy, which means that you're going to have folks who have to pay more for the energy that they're already paying just to have the energy necessary to have a functioning household, et cetera, et cetera. In other words, these kinds of impacts are the very kinds of impacts that you're all familiar with that really are negative, to say the least. And low-income people will be the ones who will feel those disproportionately. In other words, they will feel them out of context, out of percentage, if you did a percentage comparison of communities and so on, and others will as well. And I think, again, Ben Jones, as I said, I recommend this piece to you, this book to you, but it is the great moral challenge then to think about this disproportionate impact on low-income communities. And this is my one moment of comedy here. This is a great moral challenge facing the movement for climate solutions and the broader movement for ecological solutions as a whole. Again, this was written in 2008. For instance, we know that climate activists eventually will convince Congress to adopt market-based solutions. That's a laugh line. But the bottom line is, down the road, as we are achieving the kinds of economy and the kinds of policy and the kinds of solutions that we want to achieve, are we, again, refusing to leave others behind? Are we thinking about these impacts? Are we making things happen for low-income people? Well, this is my background as a lawyer. I tell a lot of, I build a case. This is what I'm doing. I'm building a case for you as you're watching it right in front of your eyes here. So I'll continue to build a case by talking about, well, what did we try to do in Lincoln? When I was with Mayor Byler here in Lincoln, and we did many, many things. What did we do that actually went to this question of disproportionate impact? That we literally did recognize and say we need to incorporate that into our policy making. Not our legal work per se, but our policy making about what the city of Lincoln can do and how it's doing it. And we generated a number of projects. Clean Green Lincoln program is still going on. It's all about the city of Lincoln doing things that actually achieve a much more green and sustainable Lincoln. Sustainable Lincoln project then there was about coming up with goals and targets and plans that would help the city of Lincoln move forward into becoming one of the most environmentally friendly green cities, not just in the Midwest, but really in the country. And Mayor Biden and others are very committed to that. And so we did a lot of work around energy efficiency, a lot of work around renewable energy, such that, for example, community education projects, the Lincoln Energy Challenge. We did things in which we upgraded nonprofits that serve low-income people and worked with them to improve their facilities and lower their energy bills so they have more money to have programs for victims of domestic violence or the homeless or food programs, things of that nature. In other words, basically put money in their pockets by facilitating an improved place to work and things of that nature. We worked very hard, and this is one of those sort of small little things that maybe nerds like me and others are excited about it, but worked very hard to get the building codes upgraded in the city so that we can get to a place where when you build things, when you rebuild things and so on, you have to do it in a way that's extremely energy conservation and so on, and very much built around the idea of we're going to lower our carbon impact. Only somewhat successful because there's a lot of political work around building codes, let me tell you. But the point being, we worked hard to get that to happen. We did tons of financing and projects around renewable energy. Folks, this earlier this fall, the big solar power farm west of Lincoln, that was a major initiative out of the mayor's office in LES to get that to happen. That Nebraska would be, or Lincoln would be the first place in the area to have such an amazing 4 or 5 megawatt solar farm. So if you haven't seen it, just go out on the interstate, drive back someday from Grand Island or something, you'll see it off to the left, west of Lincoln. But we did it. We put solar power on municipal buildings. I mentioned earlier the project we did with students and so on. But it was a major effort to try to figure out how to, just as a city, this is our policy. We're thinking about how to do things. What are we promoting? What are we doing that actually would benefit low-income people as well as the community as a whole? And we also paid for did job training programs to get people into more opportunities in the new green economy, as Van Jones and others would call it. That is jobs to do energy efficiency work in particular, but other kinds of efforts that are out there. We did lots of transportation work and things where we really promoted what you're seeing right now with Star Trek, going to this new approaches to things. Those red buses, how many here have been on the red buses back and forth from downtown, which are natural gas buses? The goal is to move the entire city bus line into a natural gas and then ultimately into a hybrid and then ultimately into a non-fossil fuel public transit system, believe it or not. And also at the same time thinking about how can we bring those particular lines into low-income neighborhoods, keep the costs down, all of those sorts of things. So we were thinking about disproportionate impact. And then on stormwater, I referenced stormwater because that's a big deal. A ton of work was put into thinking about when we have climate change related major storm events, which Lincoln has had now in the last 5 years, 3 or 4 of them. That can arguably has to be laid at the feet of climate change because you don't have 200 or 300 year flood events and rain events in a couple of years without there being some kind of other explanation for it. In any event, that creates the risk of flooding. We'll talk about it in a minute and so on. But the reality is that we can do other things. We can design our stormwater system so that it is more green, it is more ecologically friendly. And that's happened in Lincoln. We have an ordinance now that requires that everything we do related to stormwater and the systems that deal with that has to be done in a way that is basically no concrete, very little concrete, and a lot of very green and friendly ways of keeping water here, keeping water, greening up environments so that they don't shed water, things of that nature. In other words, thinking about it as a mitigation and adaptation strategy, and where are these things happening in lower income neighborhoods that will benefit because they tend to be in the floodplains and so on. So, last but not least in the city project, I want to mention this is a big deal. We had $10 million for a program we call the Re-Energize program. paid for by our stimulus money that Congress gave us to. It's play money, really, is what I want to say. Yeah, so what should we do with this money? And so we created with the city of Omaha the Re-Energize program, which was expressly, almost, not wholly, but very much expressly about how do we get energy efficiency to become much more of a driving the market for energy, and how do we particularly do that in low-income neighborhoods and help low-income neighborhoods to realize the benefits of a much more energy-efficient economy. That's kind of a big aspect for, we paid for people to get jobs and be trained to do energy efficiency. We launched a variety of programs to subsidize and pay for whole house upgrades for low-income houses. They had to be below a certain amount of income and so on. To complement really the weatherization programs that already exist with the community action agencies, which are very big programs, with very minimal funding. And we did things such as created loan programs, work with credit unions to try to get people to take out money and take out loans that were subsidized by the city. And we created lots and lots of free services, and like I said, job creation. We also paid for people to be trained and licensed and certified. It was all about creating a market, but at the same time, helping over 3,000 some households in the two cities to get the benefit of this energy efficiency work. Almost entirely focused on low-income neighborhoods. Why can I say that? A, because we had an income qualification for certain of our services, the freer stuff. And B, we did it in a targeted zone in the city of Lincoln, and we did it in a targeted zone in Omaha, which is the neighborhoods that are low-income, older houses, and so on. Now, what's Green for All here? Why do I reference that? It's because the bottom line, that's the organization that Van Jones created that we then worked with to design our program with Re-Energize. So Re-Energize, I actually went to Oakland, California, and spent a couple of days working with them, thinking about how do we engineer a Re-Energize program of this sort, and how do we make it work? And we did. We spent $10 million, helped over 3,000 families, and really helped the market move in a number of ways. All right, what are the legal implications then? That's the bottom line. I told you I was building a case here. What's the bottom line for us as we think about all of this disproportionate impact, low-income people, the kinds of things that are possible in terms of policy and things that are flying about? And the reality is, I think I'm skipping ahead. Here we go. The reality is, when we think about legal implications, are we talking about, are people breaking laws? Are people not, are they discriminating against people? Are there things that are out there that, when you think about civil law, which again is what legal aid does, and we think about what is civil law, it regulates the interaction that we have in our employment, in our streets, in our, who can bother who on Saturday night, and all that kind of stuff. What about that could possibly raise legal implications with respect to all this big picture I've just painted? And the bottom line is, it actually is not that hard. Because when you think about it, what we really have are two very basic principles that we at Legal Aid think about all the time when it comes to low-income people and their issues. Legal aid is all about, first of all, enforcing laws that exist on the books. What exists in terms of who is able to do X, who is responsible for Y, who's allowed to do things, who is required to do things, what are the standards by which you're supposed to follow, who is accountable for bad things or good things when they happen. All of these kinds of things. These are laws on the books as we speak. That includes all the environmental laws, of course, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, all the land use issues. Even zoning laws are the kinds of laws that I'm talking about. In other words, the laws that regulate our lives. These are the things that regulate our lives. Well, unfortunately, these laws are rarely actually applied equally, shall we say. And there's a lot of reasons for that. There's a lot of very basic concepts behind equal protection law that I want to bring to bear with these implications, with these impacts that low-income communities are facing due to climate change. When I'm talking about equal protection law, I'm saying that all these laws must be equally administered, must be equally addressed and brought to bear on the lives of people in similar ways. Unfortunately, that's not the case in America today because who gets basically protection, the equal protection of the law more than other people? It's those who can afford to get equal protection of the law. It's those who can actually say, wait a minute, I want my right here, I want my right there to be protected. That's where legal aid steps in and says, well, hold on, that's our job, is to figure out what are the areas in which our clients are not seeing that there's an equal protection of the law to be applied. Because believe it or not, we don't have a bad bunch of laws, really. We don't have, I oftentimes think about it that I kind of inherited when I got into the legal field. I inherited a range of laws and a range of activity that was a pretty darn good set of stuff. You're not able to on a consumer basis. There's laws that regulate deceiving people. There's laws that regulate whether or not you can charge this or do that. And there's certainly laws across the board. You can't discriminate against people based upon lots of things: age, race, gender, so on. These are laws. These are actual things. And furthermore, you can't do things such as have public bodies cannot do things that inequitably ultimately affect people differently. So equal protection of laws has been the driving force behind much of the environmental justice work. So when you're talking about when a landfill gets placed somewhere, or when there's a toxic pollution problem as a result of some chemical plant, there are actual equal protection laws related to that, because much of that is found, most of that has been fostered and created by the actions of our lawmakers to make laws to make that happen. They made decisions, which is the making of law, that said we're going to put the landfill there. But wait a minute, why did you put the landfill there instead of over here? Well, there may very well then be significant questions about is this being equitably done in the sense of, maybe the people over here have protected status. Maybe there are ways in which we can look at where they live and make an argument that there is environmental laws that are not followed, or zoning laws that are not followed. But again, why am I saying that? It seems somewhat obvious, because most people do not have the ability, low-income communities have the ability to raise the claim, but wait a minute, the laws are screwing me over, but they're helping them out. Why is that? So, basic principle, equal protection of law, that's what I'm pointing out is the driving force behind the remainder of what I'm going to be talking about. And the second thing, which is a very related area, is this equitable access to the opportunities available. It's not quite the same thing, because it really is the, we might be able to make an equal protection of law claim. We might be able to say, hey, this is not being done in an equal way, or a way that the law is intended to be done, which is in an equal way. But what I'm talking about are programs. I'm talking about efforts to help people to do things, or people to get breaks on doing things. So much of what goes on at the policy that I described quite at length there is actual direct decisions made by lawmakers and public policy makers that actually have the force of law. But say, if we had done re-energized differently and said that the only way you could get this help is if you have $5,000 and put it on the barrelhead, and then we'll come in and spend $10,000 to pick up the house. If that was our only program, on the face of it, there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. It's just an economic thing. But what if the impact of that is to say, well, you're leaving out poor people, you're leaving out people of color, you're leaving out communities that cannot afford this, and so on and so forth. That would be potential a legal problem that creative lawyers like myself and others would be able to raise, because it's not, certainly not an equal protection law, but it's more, you're not giving the equitable or equal access to the opportunities that the law is ultimately trying to make happen. So, without getting into the depths of the weeds of what's the state of the law in each of these areas, which frankly we have to pause. I will go when we get to the end of this discussion. I will say, hey, after November 8th, I don't know exactly where we're going with a lot of these things, because it's hard to say what will happen. But the point is, this is the kind of stuff that legal aid does. We think about how do we, in fact, reinforce and protect the rights that people have how do we enforce the laws that are actually on the books that actually go to these kind of basic questions, that helps get people the opportunities or have their rights protected so they don't have to experience a negative situation. How do we make that happen? All right, well, let's apply it to some of these categories here. So in the energy context, OPPD and LES, for example, want to go to a system where they're requiring every ratepayer, the electric, these are again public power, publicly owned utilities, where every ratepayer pays a higher amount for their fixed costs, and then will pay a lower cost for their actual energy use, because that's to promote conservation and to make it happen when there's less energy being used. Well, as environmentalists, we look at that and say, heck yeah, conservation rates, that's a great thing. You want to have that. But what if the impact is to increase the cost of energy to low-income people who already are some of the most assiduous conservators you're ever going to see, but still have the $300 gas bill because their home is like an open shed? What about that? What are the implications of that? The implications of that, from my perspective, is pretty clear. That's one of those situations where a public body, the publicly owned utilities, are creating a situation where the impacts are being inequitably burdened, or being inequitably borne, as a matter of cost to an individual, household, things of that nature. Legal aid is very interested in that subject, very interested in this matter, because that's a classic example of we're trying to help people keep money in their pockets, or trying to help them deal with their poverty. We see that these kinds of issues actually affects not just their it has the direct impact of taking more money out of their pockets for what? For maybe a public good. This is a good idea, but it actually has a negative effect on all people. Now, the other aspect of energy that I find very interesting, and we're going to be working on, is also related to what I just said a few minutes ago. All of our utilities have conservation programs, energy efficiency programs. But again, you have to pay for it. You have to be able to spend the money to do so. How do we do more things that actually takes that situation and actually puts it on its head and say, as a public entity, as a public body, your first priority is to figure out how you can make more people with less means be able to take advantage of this program. At least that's a responsibility. Are there some legal implications to that? And the short answer is yes. Clever lawyering, laws on the books, rights on the books can be used to try to push that issue. And I know we're running a bit out of time, so I'm going to go pretty quick here. I'm going to jump to water and food. Water conservation in our state is a huge issue. I think what we're going to see, similar to the energy context, is we're going to see much more concentrated expenditures on the water infrastructure. And the question becomes then, wait a minute. Again, it's a basic need. If we raise the cost to people, to low-income communities, to improve the water infrastructure, to increase conservation, to find a better source of water. Back in the summer of 2012, Lincoln almost ran out of water, by the way. I was very much an active participant in what to do if the Platte River dries up, Lincoln has no water. Those kinds of questions become, again, who's bearing the burden? What's the impact? What are the costs? Those are all very legitimate questions that legal aid want to continue to raise. Essentially, what we're looking at is higher burden of cost in general. It's exciting to see, for example, there's a recycling initiative here in Lincoln to finally get the city council to require that recycling be something that everybody has offered to them. And unfortunately, the nature of the way this has been going is that everybody gets it offered to them, but then there's no price control, there's none of that sort. The actual, if this ever comes to pass, the waste hauler can charge whatever they want on the additional recycling. So if you're between a rock and a hard place, which is where most of our people are, as I've been describing here, this is another one of the examples of dealing with a public policy issue in a way that may actually have the negative rebound against the burdens that have to be borne by local people. So, you name it, we can come up with an issue related to almost any of these categories that allows for us to think about those two principles. Is there equal protection laws being applied? Or is there equitable access to the opportunities that such programs or regulatory things or approaches allow for? skipping very quickly here, I want to go to some legal aid efforts that I definitely want to emphasize, because we already at legal aid are doing things about this. Disaster relief is a project that we have moved on aggressively, and as you can tell from this slide, what this project is a project to prepare communities, low-income communities in particular, but definitely communities, and about disasters that may occur, floods and other kinds of disasters. And to, most importantly, to get lots and lots of lawyers engaged with the idea that we can help when there's a disaster, if there's a big tornado out in Alma or something, that there is in fact a team of lawyers that can come in and do work. Well, believe it or not, most people are just flat out not prepared for any disasters, much less low-income people in these kind of communities. No insurance, no knowledge, no real preparation of any sort. And on the flip side of that is there's little to no ability to do anything about it after it happens. So, how do we make sure that we get protected? How do we make sure that we get an insurance payment that might exist, or a FEMA payment, or how do we make sure that we have an opportunity down the road? Local people basically get the shaft on all of that. So this project is to work on that, and we have a wonderful disaster guide, legal guide, that goes through the gamut of landlord-tenant, insurance, healthcare, document, benefits, immigration, you name it, kind of legal issues, which come up in the context of when your life is turned topsy-turvy. These things happen. How do you deal with it? How do you know what to do? How do you protect your rights? A very, it's an example in sort of small, not so small, but definitely targeted way of what I've been talking about with respect to the legal implications. The Disaster Relief Project is all about how do we deal with the legal implications of a disaster, much of which are caused by climate change, on low-income communities and other communities. My perspective on this takes the next step, which is that's the same perspective we need to take, thinking about anything related to the effects of climate change, the impacts of climate change that can be identified. That this kind of a project is a forerunner of that. And we've also done a considerable amount of floodplain outreach in Lincoln in an effort to talk to low-income communities specifically about what they understand and what they know about the floodplain issue, and the fact they will be speaking of being on the front line of climate disaster. When there's a flood in Lincoln, Nebraska, we know where it's going. And it's going right into low-income neighborhoods in the area. And what we heard by talking to people and distributing information is that folks, almost all were renters, and of course, they didn't know a lot didn't know they're in floodplain, but most importantly, 74% didn't have flood insurance and don't really even know much about flood insurance. And that's a topic that we will be working on a lot, because why is flood insurance available to some and not to others? Why if a climate change disaster would occur right here in the North Bottoms, and 100 people, 500 people lose everything they have, but they don't have any insurance? How did we not think about that up front when others did have insurance, and as a society we helped facilitate that? Clearly we have some obligations. So legal aid has been out and about. We have a lot of projects to do that very kind of thing of communicating. I've got the postcard here that is really kind of a cool postcard that we distributed in both the North and South Bottoms, and there's the postcard right there, which talks about flooding and what you need to know, and that basically you need to get a hold of legal aid and look at what we've got going on with legal aid. And I just want to very briefly reference that, again, getting back to Dave's point, that we've had a lot of studies done out of the city. Well, legal aid was very fortunate to work this past spring with the 319 class on an impact study right here in Lincoln on the same theme, which is, okay, there are impacts of climate change going on in Lincoln right now on local populations. How is it being, let's take a snapshot or a look at how it's playing out in a couple of areas. Transportation is one, and food, and the availability of fresh and good food is another. And the students looked at, how does StarTran go about figuring out what it's doing, and these city policies, do they make sense, and are there potentially some of these equal protection of the law and equitable access to the law kind of issues that reside in these kinds of decisions? These are just maps that I'm going to skip over very quick. Food deserts, the food desert issue is a huge issue. That is, in my opinion, a climate change related impact because of the nature of how the tug and the pull on the food supplies and so on over time, the costs and expenses going up for fresh food and all of that. So lots to be done to think about things through the prism of the implications under the law for what's happening with climate change and how they affect and impact people around the country, around the city, around the state. And I just want to point out, finally, we do a lot of work to build collaborations and partnerships and are out there in the community. And this past summer, we had an entire project where, as part of the disaster relief project, we had college students and recent grads that went to dozens of events and met with many, many hundreds if not thousands of people around the state. Not just talking about, are you thinking about what's going to happen when climate disaster comes to your doorstep, but also, here's what legal aid is and here's how we can help you. Not just with that issue, but with other issues as well. There's a lot of new relationships formed and so on. So to conclude here, what's ahead? As I said, I built a whole case here about why we are interested in the legal implications of climate change impacts on local populations. But what's ahead really boils down to continuing to do what we've been doing. It's unknown, obviously, but we need to think in terms of how we can structure partnerships with low-income communities, with the environmental studies folks, with students, with groups that care about what's happening with low-income communities around these impacts of climate change, and are willing to step forward and say, hey, if you want to make a case out of this, as we would say, if you want to make a federal case out of this, maybe we should do that. Maybe that's something to do to ensure that the rights of low-income people are being protected in the context of decisions being made or opportunities being presented around climate change. So we're very much legally wanting to do that in the course of the next few years. And we also are thinking about very specifically as to how it relates to our effort to help people get out and out of poverty. Because if we don't think about their lives in this way, the likely problems they're going to have, the issues they're going to face, and think about how we can get ahead of that curve and help them to be in a better place, we're not really doing our jobs. We're just functionaries in a justice system. If we're just waiting for the day we have to help people get evicted from their homes because of the flood, or have to help people, tell people that they're not going to be able to get anything out of this because, well, that's just the way it goes. No, we're going to get a little outside of this table. So, with that, there's my opening statement was, and the Van Jones work that I've been referring to, is that the operating principle is we have to address the impacts on the poor, and nobody is to be left behind. As we move forward as environmentalists, as social change advocates, as lawyers, nobody needs to be left behind when thinking about these impacts. And Mary Piper from Lincoln, puts it well, but this is our only world after all. We're all in this together. So with that, I know that I ran over a bit. I'm happy to answer any questions that we still have a minute or two. I'll turn to Christine.
Well, thank you so much, first of all. Olivia, how much time do we have for questions?
We actually do not have any time for questions.
Oh.
But you and Lincoln are more than welcome to stay and obviously discuss with Milo. But we'll end on time here, and I haven't gotten any questions yet, so.
If you really,
I do have a question.
I'm happy to pass those on if you receive any from the attendees.
There is one question. Somebody says, hold on. Does the fixed rate that the public utilities like OPPD passed violate the quote from the Power Review Board that says, when the applicant alleges that the electric power supplier is not treating all customers and applicants within the same rate class fairly and without discrimination?
That's a great question, because that reveals that something to the audience here. Laws are all over the place, and there are regulations that the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission has regarding what local. You would think that the OPPDs and OFs can do whatever they want, but that's not true. They have to stay within certain parameters and do things certain ways with rates and how they generate power and how they deliver power and so on. Not too surprising, but nevertheless, it's the minutia of the law. And what that reference was there are laws that regard you cannot discriminate among people within your rate base or sectors of your rate base by price, and you have to have a heck of a lot of justification as to do that. Well, the short answer is yes. I think that's a very important implication. I think that's one of the hooks that we'll be hanging our hat on in the next few months and years to talk about how to make sure that the implications of these kinds of decisions are not borne by low-income people more than other people, because that would be a form of discrimination, possibly price discrimination, and so on. But the short answer is also utilities already do that. Industries, for example, and large employers pay a lot less per kilowatt hour than you and I do. And the question is, well, wait a minute, how is that not a violation of that particular provision, et cetera, et cetera. So as you can tell, there is plenty to be thought about, and creative people need to be thinking about it.
Do we have any questions in the room here? Yes.
Do you do any online collaborations with reservations in Nebraska?
Reservations, you bet. In fact, and right here in Lincoln, right here, which Shirley Peng is with the Disaster Relief Project, we are just launching new work with Native American tribes around the Disaster Relief Project. And I don't know exactly how that's going to play out, but indeed, Legal Aid does a lot with Native Americans. It's one of our major sub-projects is our Native American representation work. But this is, again, a use of our disaster relief work to get in with the tribes and talk about the impacts of climate change and climate disasters and big disasters and so on those populations.
Milo, I was surprised at the amount of poverty in rural Nebraska in some of the counties. For example, Pierce County was, I think, the highest one. What form does that? How does it show up in Pierce? I mean, if you walk around here in the campus, you see, it's not, houses aren't well kept, and then you kind of see what does the form take the same in Pierce?
What does rural poverty look like?
Yeah, what does rural poverty look like?
It's more invisible than sort of an urban variety. That's you're exactly right. But the housing stock in cities and towns across the state are in varying states pretty disarray. I mean, that's a major policy problem for the state of Nebraska. How do we have enough affordable housing for all the people that we have in the state? And not only affordable, but quality and decent housing. So the short answer to your question is there's a lot of invisible poverty, living amongst trailers, living amongst old houses, living in communities that, are pretty good communities for folks in the community kind of way. I don't want to discount, and we all have lives in our own neighborhoods, in our own communities. It's all good, but it's extremely low resource. And, and the worries are different than my worries, and other worries are, economically, socially, and so on. But largely in rural towns and rural communities, it's going to be more invisible, more integrated into the community to some degree, but most definitely still a reality for these people that they do not have enough money in hand, they don't have enough income, enough resources to think about things like, how am I going to do this to support my family? How am I going to do that to move my kids forward? All those kinds of questions.
So in terms of the impact of climate, urban versus rural poor, what does that, what are the differences or what does that look like?
Well, I think, in a floodplain context, you're going to have lots of communities that have. The floodplains that we did the outreach project with here in Lincoln, we're identified with the floodplain people of the state of Nebraska that understand floodplain and floods very well, and also are able to cross-reference things such as income levels, and we're able to cross-reference census tracts and things like that. So we know there are low-income populations that need to be reached in floodplains, and that I think is possible across the state. You go to Fremont, you go to small towns along, the North Loop or whatever. These are all potential issues that relate to them. How prepared are they? Are we helping them to be prepared? Do we know that their rights are going to be protected and something like that?
Anyone else? Anything else from you, Olivia?
We have one that says, are there specific cases in Nebraska filed for low-income neighborhoods in regards to climate change?
What was the beginning of that? I didn't quite catch that.
Are there specific cases in Nebraska filed for low-income neighborhoods in regards to climate change?
Oh, specific cases. So, for example, I would say that that's probably, I don't know that I could actually point to any specific case per se. This is an area of law that we're most definitely developing. But I will say this, we've made a commitment to bringing those very cases. That's what you're hearing today. When we're thinking about the floodplain issue in particular, I've asked our staff to look at it from the perspective of what's the implications of the flood insurance program as it plays out with low-income Nebraskans. And if what are the legal potential barriers and challenges that people have that we could address through the law to try to lower those barriers to them getting protected through flood insurance programs. That's a crystallized legal issue that we're looking at, but that's an example of the kind of thing we're looking at. I know I can be very abstract, but also turn around and be very concrete. So sorry if I lose something on this.
Okay, that's all the questions we have on our end. So thank you very much for your presentation. It was excellent.
Thank you.
And then just for the future ones, so we're taking a break in January, so there won't be an SLPS in January. And then our next one will be February 2nd, hosted by Central Community College, and James Connolly of the International Living Future Institute will be presenting on the Living Product Challenge. So thank you again, Milo, for speaking. And thank you to UNL Environmental Studies for hosting, and thank you to all of our viewers for attending. So happy holidays, and we will hopefully see you guys in February.
Happy holidays.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.